We are so excited to welcome on the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the author of the fantastic book, The Education of an Idealist, which comes out in paperback on January 26th, I believe, our friend Samantha Power. Sam, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Tommy and Ben. Thrilling.
So we have had you on to talk about the book before. For folks who didn't listen to that interview, you should go back and do so because I think it is a must read for anyone who wants to go into government. It's a must read for anyone who wants to understand what it's like when ideas and idealism and principles crash into the complexity of governing and tackling like historically difficult challenges like Syria. So, first question for you: how is your idealism holding up after seeing a fascist mob crash into the U.S. Capitol and ransack it last week? Like, how is that making you feel about government in our role in this country at the moment?
Well, it does feel like, just as on the international stage, as you all talk about so often, there's a battle between the authoritarians and the Democrats, or the people in some places and the state. There's a battle that some version of that dualism is at play in our own society. And the very kinds of acts of incitement, acts of repression, the creation of enemy lists, which President Trump did from the beginning of his presidency, including, of course, the media as a whole, that is going to bear consequences at some point. And in some ways, it's a miracle it took this long, right?
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, and, as many people have said, you can be shocked but not be surprised at the same time. I'm still trying to explain that to my son as to how you can
Yeah.
be shocked and not surprised, but you can. And yet in Michigan, we saw a chronicle foretold. We saw exactly this. It just was neutralized. It wasn't in the Capitol. It wasn't our elected officials who have enabled, some of whom have enabled President Trump for so long, themselves having to cower, for fear for their lives. But as someone, as I write in Education of an Idealist, who started her career in Bosnia, a place that had just hosted the Olympics 8 years before the war started, a place where intermarriage was 1 in 3 in Sarajevo, this was a place where no one thought that violence could be fomented on ethnic or religious grounds. And I also, of course, originally am from Ireland, and such an incredibly cosmopolitan, civilized, educated place. And yet we had the troubles in the early part of my childhood, and well beyond. And so this idea that we are immune, I think, has always been a dangerous illusion, a kind of subcomponent maybe of American exceptionalism, this idea that our virtue will inherently kind of protect us from some of these darker forces. It won't. What will protect us will be our citizens, their activation, our law, and whether people are willing to respect it and enforce it, and our institutions, which have bent to their breaking point in so many domains over the course of this 4 years, but did not break insofar as, if we had talked before the election, I don't know that we would have guessed, or at least I'll speak for myself and not project onto my friends here, but, it is quite remarkable, not that Trump lost in court. It was obvious he was going to lose in court because he was making stuff up, but that he lost before every judge, right? That even those judges whose, track records or whose CVs made them to the American Bar Association unqualified maybe to become judges. And I'm not saying that was among the 50 plus judges who heard cases in this domain, but just in general, there hasn't been exactly a great premium placed on track records and expertise and so forth. And yet the courts just did say, look, you need a legal predicate. You need evidence. Like, we're kind of old fashioned that way. In courtrooms, you need evidence. And so I think all of us have said, oh gosh, what if the election had been Florida? What if it had been Florida 2000? Then would the courts have held up? Then would the institutions have held? I think we can all be relieved that proposition was not tested, and that Biden established a number of paths to victory. But I think all of us, just last week, it just was this dualism at work. You had Georgia which was brought about 100% by the faith that citizens who had seen their votes suppressed, who had seen the most creative tactics to keep them away from the polls and to disenfranchise them, refusing to take no for an answer, and organizing and getting out the vote and registering voters who hadn't even voted in November to be part of this very slim margin, but nonetheless incredibly joyful and essential for the Biden presidency outcome. And then you had that other force storming the Capitol, egged on by the president, and showing just how far this has gone and how that toxicity has now gotten to the point of just being a dangerous criminal element in our society. And so that joy and that kind of terror and foreboding, I haven't in my life, I don't think, experienced anything quite like that. Both of those forces kind of surfacing. It just this is the fight, right? It's between the organizers and the citizens who made Georgia happen, and then those who don't want to respect the will of the majority, who don't want to respect the rule of law and our institutions, and who are increasingly prepared to take matters into their own hands. That's the fight.
Yeah. Well, look, Sam, I want to actually ask you a question about the UN, which connects to this, but the Trump administration, because the reason it connects obviously is that the world saw that, and the world has seen the Trump years, and the world knows that just voting Trump out isn't going to change the threat of authoritarianism and the threat of this kind of extrajudicial mob that we saw. But I wanted to focus on the UN because you do such a great job in your book. One reason to pick it up in laying out kind of how you approach the job of being UN ambassador and how you approached being the person who sat behind that placard that said United States. That is the way in which a lot of the rest of the world interacts with the US through what our UN ambassador is saying. The Trump people have completely, other than being a springboard for Nikki Haley's future political ambitions, we don't even hear about the UN. They don't even demagogue it. It's just totally absent. Like I couldn't even tell you the name of the donor person who's the perm rep right now. And because of our audience cares about this issue, and we haven't talked about the UN much on the show, what is the task for the United States now, the Biden administration, at the UN? How do we reassert our engagement there? How do we take whatever has atrophied at the UN and try to make it work better? If you were, as you described so well in your book, meeting with every ambassador from other countries and organizing a team, how should we be thinking about if the Biden administration is rejoining the world in all these different forms? What does that look like at the United Nations? What would you most like to see happen there?
It's such a great question, and it's an exciting one. And I think in Linda Thomas Greenfield, we have somebody who's going to, be a very, very popular American diplomat just because of her own sort of inherent humility, her background, and her dedication to addressing poverty and conflict in the prior parts of her career. Maybe her gumbo, which keeps coming up, that she apparently makes a mean gumbo. But I think that there are two dimensions. And the first is the place that now all of us who've worked in national security our whole careers, where we're forced to start, which is what is happening at home. To what extent is the president-elect, then President Biden and Vice President Harris, to what extent are they now, especially that they have the Senate, able to deliver, for example, stimulus to our economy, paychecks to people who've been lining up at food banks, and whose savings have been devastated over the course of the last year? To what extent, perhaps in the wake of the ghastly events last week, can there be some semblance of a show of bipartisanship, at least in certain domains? Maybe on COVID domestically. Again, recognizing there are some who've implanted themselves, in the science denial camp. But there are many responsible Republican governors and local officials and other state officials who are trying to kick the pandemic to the curb. And now in Biden, they'll have a president who will be a great partner. I think that show of bipartisanship is incredibly important alongside the show of competence and the show of democratic renewal in embracing press conferences, transparency, ethics, real questions, of course, and I'm sure the world will be very interested in how past transgressions or alleged crimes are addressed, what happens in the look back, as it were. Remember President Obama, we all were part of an administration that made the judgment that it was better to move forward because of how divisive it would have been to go back and look at torture through the lens of legal accountability and so forth. So we moved in a forward-looking direction. Biden has some really challenging decisions ahead of him in that domain, but those are the kinds of things that people abroad are going to be looking to. So I think that even though you asked me about the UN and I'm talking about things you always talk about, that's what the UN, the people from other countries at the UN are going to be most interested by. And I'll just give you one anecdote to this respect. And our friend Susan Rice, Ambassador Rice, of course, was my predecessor at the UN. And she said this to me before I went in the job, and I didn't quite believe it until I experienced it myself. But she said when President Obama was trying to negotiate the ACA, and you remember just the slim margins on the votes and the torturous negotiations and the fear that, with the passing of the great Senator Kennedy, that maybe it wouldn't go through. And she said her colleagues in New York at the UN were tracking that as closely as any Security Council resolution related to their country. In other words, the question of whether America would be able to realize the right to health in its population and for its uninsured was so important to other countries because it's really is about creating a model and an example. Not that the catching up with some of our Western democratic friends was going to put us in the forefront on healthcare, but nonetheless, it was something they were tracking like crazy. I would attend the State of the Union, and you would be busy with Favreau writing the State of the Union and the foreign policy section, the way the ambassadors from other countries kind of hung on every word. Our domestic debates really, really matter, and our recovery, not only recovering from last week, but also given how many other countries are dealing with some of these same dark and xenophobic and bigoted forces, if we could crack the code, if we can show that our rule of law is strong and that our institutions will hold up, that's actually we have something that we never wish to have in common with countries that are racked by similar problems, but maybe we'll be able to also brainstorm with them and offer lessons about what doesn't work and what does. So that's in the what happens in America bucket. Then there's, I think, where your question more naturally leads, which is, okay, what matters right now to other countries? And I think the way President-elect Biden has talked about his own priorities as president, it's almost like priority 1 is COVID and the economy, priority 2 is COVID and the economy, priority 3 is COVID and the economy. And of course, the climate crisis and the racial injustice and all of that needs to be embedded, and addressing those issues needs to be embedded in how we recover economically and how we address inequality and take this as an opportunity to, borrow a phrase, to build back better. There's all of that, but where's everybody else in the world? COVID and the economy. Yeah. So I think part of what Ambassador Thomas Greenfield will be doing at the UN is trying, as we did during the Ebola crisis, to catalyze the kind of global conversation, global contributions that are going to be needed to meet people where they are, which is, as you know, right now, developing countries are not on track to get significant shares of the vaccine. The pool of money and the sort of fundraising that has been attempted by the World Health Organization and COVAX, this vaccine initiative, has not produced the resources that are needed. And of course, rich countries like our own are much higher up in the queue. And we're having a hard enough time ourselves getting vaccines into arms. So in the first bucket, we will show that we can vaccinate our own people and get America back to work. But because, and this is where I hope Republicans will come on board, because our ability to not only restart our economy, but to have our economy roar back to life in a way that will benefit all Americans, we need the economy in Bangladesh, where our supply chains extend into, and in India, and in sub-Saharan Africa. We need the economic engine of the world to come back to life. And that is going to require serious investments in the global response to COVID. And the form that takes, again, I think people are still trying to work through. China has stepped into that void, as you know, after we left the WHO, but also in providing PPE and in meeting people in this great hour of need. But there's plenty of need to go around. And that is one domain where one could imagine a division of labor that would actually be in the interest of all of us.
You know, we've talked so much about Trump over the last 4 years. It's been really fun and exciting to think about the Biden administration. And it started with, you know, seeing a lot of our friends and former colleagues going back into government, a lot of brilliant, great people. Early on, I would say there weren't a lot of surprises. One surprising choice that was announced this week was Bill Burns was tapped to run the CIA. So for listeners, Bill Burns is the former Deputy Secretary of State. He is a lifetime career diplomat. I think he was ambassador to Russia, to Jordan. He negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement. The guy speaks like 8 languages. He's just a super interesting, outside the box, exciting pick, in my opinion, because he is this career diplomat who I think will be someone who thinks about intelligence as a way to help his work, diplomatic work, help policymakers, and not necessarily like the Department of Defense Junior. Sam, I'm curious, what message you think it sends to the world, to the administration, to select a career diplomat like Bill to run the CIA?
Well, I think one of the things that the president-elect has really emphasized, in part because of his sense that we're so over-militarized, right, and that the wars have gone on too long, and that military families have borne such unimaginable burdens over these last 2 decades since 9/11, I think he's wanted to right-size the toolbox. And, there's the metaphor that people in Washington sometimes use of the stool, where you have the defense leg, the diplomacy leg, and the development leg. And we go, the one leg of the stool, is much longer than the other two. And I think Biden is trying to remedy that. And so one of his mantras, I think, in these last weeks has been, we're going to lead with diplomacy. So even on COVID, right, we're going to lead with diplomacy, get a sense of what other countries are doing, how we can chip in or catalyze, getting back to the Iran nuclear deal. Hopefully we're going to lead with diplomacy and rebuilding the diplomatic corps, rebuilding and revitalizing the development corps. And so putting a diplomat, not just any diplomat. In one of the profiles of Bill that I saw in the last couple of days, someone referred to him as a titan of the foreign policy world, right? I don't know that if you say the word diplomat and then just say, who comes to mind? I think anybody who has worked in close proximity to the State Department over the last 4 decades, pretty much everybody would say Bill Burns, right? He's just
the stash, man.
And the mustache. But so I think that's incredibly important. And you alluded to this, but just to drive it home, as a diplomat, as ambassador in Russia, as Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, as a speaker of Russian and Arabic somehow, he's been a consumer of intelligence. His whole career, he's been a consumer. And so to put somebody in that role who's saying, actually, here's what would best inform, not tilt the policy debate, right? Because there's no straighter shooter than Bill Burns. He'll be very aware of the risk, especially after the Trump years, of the politicization of intelligence. So I would worry not at all about that. But to say this is a useful way of thinking about informing policymakers on the strategic threats, the things that are long-term, and the crises that lie around the corner. There's been a lot of talk about, for example, elevating, and this, Ben, grows out of some of your work, but elevating the anti-corruption emphasis in American foreign policy. Major questions about, okay, what are the implications then for the intelligence community if we do that? If that is an Achilles heel for autocrats and authoritarians, as I think we know it is, and if civil society is very hungry all around the world to tell us that and in exposing it, what are the kinds of things that could be surfaced, right, with an emphasis on that in the information gathering space. The other part of the CIA, of course, is operations, and there to take a fresh look at, and I think because there's been so little transparency in the Trump years, and probably not nearly as much congressional oversight as we should have seen, given some of the broadened authorities that were being taken on by Trump administration officials. I think we don't even know the half of what has actually happened in the more covert space. Yeah. And for a straight shooter like Bill Burns to come into the building and to catalog all of that, and then to think through with the president and the rest of his team, okay, what is, this is again back to the idea of right sizing, what is the appropriate posture in this domain, given that the threats are real and they're out there. But, the threat of COVID, COVID is something that has taken 360,000 lives and devastated American families. And yet, was our intelligence community postured, was the CIA postured to be collecting on what was happening in labs in Asia? I doubt it. And so to go back in and say, okay, if we are broadening our conception of national security and really trying to assess and weight the various threats, because it's not as if you're not going to collect on potential terrorist threats. You need to collect on climate and the conflict that is growing out of climate all around the world. Now you have a greater emphasis and more political support for collecting on things related to pandemics and other forms of infectious diseases. Great. But how do you balance among those priorities and make sure that you're well postured for the 21st century?
Yeah, it's funny too, because I love Bill and echo everything you say. He's also got a kind of a spy's demeanor. He's like soft spoken.
He's a Le Carre.
Yeah, he's a John Le Carre character.
Tommy, you got me. I got now 2 of the books on the Kindle after hearing you and Ben talk about Le Carre last week. So, but yeah, the last thing I'd say about Bill, though, just in the straight talk realm, and I don't know if it's in the Le Carre realm, but it is noteworthy that he questioned the decision to invade Iraq at a time where that could have been politically or let's say professionally costly for him. Career ending. I think that is the risk that he took on, and I think that must be a big part of why Biden finds it appealing to imagine having him in that role, somebody who's prepared to say, no, actually, Mr. President, I don't see it that way. Our community sees it differently, and here, or these are the bad consequences we can expect or we predict if this is the direction that you seek to go. And so, again, getting the information you need to have, not the information you would wish to have.
So I wanted to ask you one question, Sam, about an issue that hasn't gotten as much attention recently. I noticed about a week ago, you and I had the exact same reaction when there was a spate of arrest of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. And Tony Blinken tweeted something about it, and I was like, wait, the U.S. actually cares about these people again. But that said, it's been really troubling to watch Hong Kong the last couple of weeks, and hasn't gotten a lot of attention because of the coups and insurrections here. But there's been this kind of wholesale, to catch people up on it, of course, China pushed through a national security law through the Hong Kong legislature that basically gave them full writ to do whatever they want in Hong Kong. And since then, particularly in the last couple of weeks, they've really been escalating, rolling up opposition, rolling up democracy activists, dangling very scary sentences, potentially life sentences among leadership like Joshua Wong. How should we think about Hong Kong? What is the toolkit, and what can be done? We're kind of watching this city be swallowed up, and the hopes of these millions of people who've been protesting be swallowed up. How should we think about it? How should the U.S. and the international community think about it? What can we do to help, if anything?
I think one of the things that this round of arrests, all of them really, it's been such a devastating year for the brave Democrats in Hong Kong, of whom there are so many. But they just, again and again, Beijing shows just how terrified the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi, is, how terrified the state is of freedom. I mean, and it's I say that because sometimes in the kind of the debate about the U.S. and China and the sense of China's GDP is going to overtake ours, and look at its growth rate and look how quickly it got COVID in check. True, but the brittleness of that system, I think, or at least their own perception of that brittleness, is demonstrated every time you see something like you saw in the last week. And the fact that, I mean, in this instance, this set of raids, right, going into newsrooms, invoking the most specious grounds for lining people up. I mean, basically, anybody who favors having an election, which is something that Hong Kong, has had in different forms, for a long time. But to see disability rights activists, I mean, one of the activists, got motivated to get into advocacy around disability rights because his daughter needed a wheelchair and she couldn't get around Hong Kong in a wheelchair, and he lobbied tirelessly to get ramps and things put in so that she'd be better able. She subsequently passed away. You're going to arrest him? You feel that small, that threatened by somebody who's trying to get wheelchair ramps put in, or to get bathrooms, to have proper accommodations for people with disabilities. So this parallels, of course, what's happened inside China, that it used to be that there was a space, if you wanted to protest environmental pollution, if you wanted, there were sexual harassment, there was a space for that. Yeah. And, over the course of the last 5 years, that space has vanished. And it's just been a much sort of all-encompassing crackdown. So you asked, though, the constructive question about the toolbox. I mean, I've listened to you and the people, of course, you interviewed for your Missing America podcast address this question. And we all know there's no silver bullet. But I would note, just on the basis of my UN background, how much China invests in avoiding being criticized. And maybe this probably gets to the brittleness they have in their own sort of self-perception of the Chinese system. But, if an incoming Biden administration does succeed in multilateralizing its condemnations, because over the course of the last year, since President Trump turned on President Xi, his former BFF, of course, the rhetoric and the sanctions and other things have come out of the Trump administration appropriately. But we just one-offs, right? Tweets, press statements, no effort to kind of build a coalition. And I think the broader that coalition is, the more that it gets in the head of Chinese Communist Party officials. Will they then, liberalize in Hong Kong? I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I think our job is to increase the cost. And you just by doing things unilaterally, as the Trump administration has done, it just really limits the impact. If you combine our GDP, the European Union GDP, and China, and Canada, that's 2.5 times the GDP of China.
Yeah.
Now it's just
economy. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's one dimension of it. And then, of course, one of the things that Biden has already spoken to is dramatically expanding our refugee program.
Yes.
Again, right? So there are going to be 125,000 slots for people to come into this country, down from President Trump's most recent cap of 15,000, the absolute lowest in the history of the refugee program, at a time where displacement, we've never had more displacement, or since Hitler, we have not had as much displacement around the world as we have now. But that's also something where I'm sure people like those who've been arrested and who've really, many of them have tried to get off the island, off Hong Kong, and it's getting harder and harder for them to even get to third countries given the crackdown. But I think we in the United Kingdom and others have made clear, that there's a place for people at least to find refuge in this ghastly period.
Well, I'm glad you brought up this issue of refugees, because it was talked about a lot in 2016 and sort of not at all since. But last week, a federal appeals court blocked President Trump's policy that would have allowed state and local governments to refuse to resettle refugees, sort of the ultimate cruel NIMBY policy area. It was a rare bit of good news in an area where, as you just mentioned, Trump and Stephen Miller have taken the numbers from like 110,000 in 16 to 18,000 as a cap this year, which doesn't even mean that many people actually got resettled into the U.S. My question for you is, the politics around refugees was hysterical and absurd, right? If you were a terrorist who wanted to come to the U.S. to do something bad, you would just visit as go through a travel visa. You wouldn't go through the refugee process, which entails extensive vetting. Do you have confidence or hope that we have sort of made the politics around this issue not quite as crazy and hysterical as they once were? And if not, what more do you think needs to be done so that, like, Joe Biden can actually enact the priorities that you just laid out when it comes to refugees?
I think what's noteworthy is how hard Trump and Stephen Miller pushed to say to the world, not only do we not want you, refugees, people with a well-founded fear of persecution, but basically we're the new Republican Party, and the Republican Party doesn't want you, and really tried to speak on behalf of the GOP, as when you're the leader of the party, you're sort of entitled to do. And what's fascinating is, well before the Fourth Circuit decision that you mentioned, which is itself important, which rejects this idea that Trump put forward that states had to opt in to taking refugees, and the tradition has been that refugees can resettle anywhere. Trump was pushing that well apart from the legal action that was being pursued by various groups on behalf of refugees. Republican governors were saying, we're not on board with what you're saying, President Trump. We want refugees. And not Republican governors in purple states, right? Like the governor of South Dakota, the governor of Tennessee, I think Oklahoma, Nebraska, Utah, with the kind of Mormon missionary tradition and those connections. And there are a lot of different reasons. I mean, some of it is actual good old-fashioned idealism and just a sense of American identity and a real discomfort with President Trump trying to, kind of blot out, use an eraser to pretend we're not a country of immigrants and a country that has provided that refuge. Some of it is historic, and often when people are kind of on their heels about contemporary refugee resettlement, you ask them, well, how do you feel retrospectively about how few Jews we let in during the Second World War? And they say, oh, that was terrible. We should have opened our doors. We should have let the St. Louis, come to port and let those people in. And they said, well, okay, so what about Rohingya refugees and Syrian refugees and Venezuelan refugees, for that matter, today? And then though some people say, oh, actually, yeah, you're right. Like there's a parallel there, and so yes, I take that point. It can't just be sort of retrospective in inclusiveness, and so some people are you can kind of talk it through a little bit, but some people, Tommy, it's about the economics. It's about communities that have been revitalized by the influx of refugees. Because as if a Syrian community, or an Iraqi community comes and settles, then, sometimes their relatives will come later, and you start to build it out, and the restaurants change, and the people who are willing to do work that maybe, younger people who've left the town were not willing to do. I mean, I when I was UN ambassador, I traveled to Buffalo, New York, having heard that this was one of these towns that was being revitalized by the flow of refugees who'd come into Buffalo. And it was amazing just to hear people who I'm pretty sure would otherwise be Trump voters, or at least some of them, but the way they just said, please, Trump had already won at the point that I went up there, but keep fighting for this pipeline and this flow of such, the people who make it here to go through our process, to get through the vetting, to find your way out of places where the borders are often closed. I mean, the ingenuity, the chutzpah, the desire to make money and to work long hours so as to be able to send remittances back home. This is a very, very agile and able workforce. And so governors, often it's the Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers, or whoever, or the Rotary Club, that is pushing this agenda. But the flow of refugees has been something that people have really valued as paying actual dividends for the health and vibrancy of their communities. So it's been, again, well before this court decision, it's been quite heartening to see that willingness to break with the sort of Trump-led party line. And you asked the question of is there now hope that the fever has broken? And that I don't know. I think we will see then if it is Biden in a posture of continuing that conversation, building on those very generous and welcoming public statements that those governors have made. Will that put people on their heels, and will partisanship kick in a way that it didn't when it was an inter-party debate? I hope that they stay true to the values that they've expressed up to this point. And I'm hopeful.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and well taken, that you have to make both the moral and the sort of practical case for every policy, but this one in particular. Samantha Power, so great to have you on. The book is The Education of an Idealist. It's out right now in hardcover. It comes out in paperback on January 26th. As always, a pleasure to talk to you. This was the best part of my week. And go Red Sox. Can we say that? Is it too early?
I don't know. All I can say is
we have Mookie Betts. We have Mookie Betts out here in LA, guys.
I know I know. I had not recovered from that, but I will say I'm not a Patriots fan, Tommy, like you. I'm a Steeler fan, so thus a heartbroken Steeler fan today. But I will say that Bill Belichick not taking the Presidential Medal of Freedom was a good thing, and speaks to how much the NFL as a whole has evolved, and not enough perhaps, but leaps and bounds away from where they were. And that's again because of the forces of light we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, the people who've stood up and protested when no one was joining them, and they just stayed the course, and now lo and behold even Bill Belichick is with them.